So you read the different talking points in the program, the West and Russia, the West and Turkey, East and South flanks, but really, you really only have to read the news of the last 2 or 3 days to know what's going on. Just to give you the examples, talks on Syria breaking down between the US and Russia, Russia suspending the weapons-grade plutonium deal, NATO fighter jets scrambling in Western Europe because Russian bombers are coming very close to NATO airspace on their way from Norway down to Spain, so we're talking about Western Europe here. And of course this is, you can see, not an outdated topic, but I think we have exactly the panel to discuss this. Of course, we can't do it without somebody from NATO. So I'm very happy that we have Ambassador Sorin Ducaru with us, Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges. Before that, he was Romania's Perm Rep, so Permanent Representative of the North Atlantic Council. So to sum it up, he knows what he's talking about. Thank you very much for coming. Give him a hand, come on. And now the country where one of the main destabilizing events occurred, of course, the annexation of Crimea by Russia, is Ukraine. So we're very glad that Ihor Dolhov could make it. He already gave us a glimpse yesterday of what he wants to talk about today. That's going to be a very important contribution, I think. He's, of course, the Deputy Defense Minister of Ukraine, and prior to that, also at NATO as the Ambassador for Ukraine. Thank you very much for coming. Nicolas Tenzer is also here. If I read the whole list of what Nicolas has done in his life, we would probably go over the hour that we have, so I'll keep it to this. At the moment, Chairman of the Center for Studies and Research on Political Decisions. He is Associate Professor of a number of schools, including ENA and Sciences Po. And of course, in this context, very important, he was the Executive Director of Aspen, France. Thank you very much for coming, Nicolas. Pleasure. And we have Rolandas Kačinskas, representing a country also on the front line, like all the Baltic states, from Lithuania. He said he was the only person from the Baltic states in the room. Is that true? No, we have more, I think. So from Lithuania, one of the main areas of reassurance and also deterrence now by NATO, Rolandas Kačinskas is Political Director at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Lithuania. Thank you for coming, Rolandas. It's a pleasure. So as you can see, we have Ukraine, Lithuania, NATO. This panel is probably not going to be hugely pro-Russian. I'm going to try to play the devil's advocate every once in a while just for the sake of discussion, but as in Twitter, views are not necessarily my own and retweets are not endorsements. But to be careful, and we're going to try to make this a fast-paced panel because we only have 1 hour. Answer a question. If you feel like somebody has said something you cannot agree on at all, feel free to interrupt. That's what we do here, all right? And let's start with you, Rolandas. Do you feel like Russia can be deterred by NATO's enhanced forward presence at the moment? Just to remind you, that's 4 battle groups, one of them also in your country, in Lithuania. Do you feel like this could really make a difference?
No, I don't think that there's a really problem with the enhanced forward presence in the Baltics and in Poland. And it would be naive to think that enhanced forward presence would provoke Russia. Russia is not afraid of the NATO forces. What we think is afraid is about the spread of the Western values. All NATO does is to respond to the Russia's posture, and it does it in the transparent way. It does it purely from the defensive point of view, and it's not even proportional. If you think what's happening in the region, you'll see that there's a constant modernization of the Western military district of Russia, having investments. A number over the last 3 years, there have been 21 large-scale snap exercises, some of them involving about 100,000 troops. So, and per force ratio, if you would measure, so NATO presence is still very much by Russia outnumbered, outgunned, and outranged. So I don't think that there's a problem with the presence.
How do you feel about this, Ambassador Ducaru? Russia reacted at the time by beefing up their own forces, keeps flying very close to NATO airspace, even some nuclear posturing at the moment. Is this going the way that NATO wants it to go, as NATO anticipated?
I don't think Russia increased its troop presence or massing of equipment and so on as a reaction of this decision in Warsaw. This was decided and actually started to be implemented way before. Now, of course, in the rhetoric, it can use any new announcement to link its own moves to what NATO does. I should mention that. Frankly, what NATO has done in Wales and in Warsaw was to have a logical, measured, but at the same time robust reaction to what Russia has done in Crimea through its illegal and illegitimate annexation, in eastern Ukraine, what Russia has done with the SNAP exercises, the rhetoric, and again, the presence, the enhanced forward presence that was decided, was not meant to match the tens of thousands of Russian troops on the eastern frontier of the alliance. If someone would do the measuring, we're speaking about 4 battalions in a number of thousands of troops each. So they were just meant actually to show that this multinational presence in countries at the frontier means that any even contemplation of really encroaching the sovereignty of any of the NATO allies would actually meet a response in a spirit of collective.
But then the question really is, if it's that way, if you say, you know, all the strengthening of Russian forces at the moment is, we don't know if that's a reaction to our plan. How do you measure and how can you tell if deterrence is working or not?
Well, deterrence is a process that you measure not necessarily instantaneously. It's a process that means accumulation of indicators. We actually used through this enhanced forward presence the model that the famous West Berlin model that everyone thought it's undefendable, but then a presence, multinational presence, but all allies assured the fact that it stayed as a entity that was part of, at that time, West Germany. And by the way, this presence in itself is not just the only element of deterrence. You should combine it to what everything else that NATO is doing, the augmentation of the rapid reaction force, the investment in reinforcement, the change of decision-making process actually within NATO, adapting the legislations within NATO countries so that the movements of capabilities can be done fast, the developments in the cyber defense field, so in the doctrine for deterrence defense, including the development of the debate in the nuclear domain. So all together is part of NATO's strengthened deterrence. And
we'll talk about cyber security a little more later if we have the time, because obviously that is your field and it's one of the most important parts of this whole thing. Ambassador Dolhov, we were talking about that last night. I mean, it all depends a little on what Putin actually wants. Is he acting rational? Where do you think he's going?
Well, it's a good question, and it's normal that in any panel, sooner or later, this question appears.
I prefer to ask in the beginning.
There is no answer. But what is important? Important is to understand that deterrence is not a question, it's a decision made by NATO. What does it mean for Ukraine? For us, it means that we are deterring force, because we really deter Russian forces on our border. And unfortunately, inside my country. So we keep around Ukrainian border more than 100,000 Russian troops. We have, unfortunately, on Ukrainian territory, in Crimea, more than 25,000 Russian troops. We have in Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast roughly 7,000 regular Russian army officers every day on the regularly basis. Does it work or not? What is the starting point? I mean, deterrence, does it work? If compare with the date of the decision in Warsaw, yes, it works, because Russian troops with separatists didn't advance deeper into Ukrainian territory. In terms of the occupation of Crimea, it doesn't work, because Crimea is still occupied. What is important? Important is that deterrence means force. To deter, one must be strong. And this is the conclusion for Ukraine. We have to reinforce our defense forces.
Is it strong enough? Is the deterrence concept strong enough?
Yes, yes. We keep, every day, we keep more than 40,000 troops on the ATO area. We doubled the number of Ukrainian army. And we will continue to build army according best practices and standards of NATO countries' armies. And we feel and we are reassured that we will continue to receive NATO support in this regard.
Nicola, obviously very important what kind of terms we use in this whole conversation. And we've been hearing the term Cold War come up a lot. There have people who made the point this is the beginning of the new Cold War. If you look how the Syria-Russia talks broke down, like I said, Russia suspending the weapons-grade plutonium deal, even if it doesn't really have to do a whole lot with denuclearization. Anyway, the symbolic of all this and the Cold War rhetoric, would you call it a Cold War rhetoric, or is that going too far?
No, definitely not. Actually, what we are witnessing is hot war, not Cold War, not Cold War. Not Cold War. We had more than 10,000 casualties, in Ukraine. We have, of course, illegal annexation of Crimea. And I will just point that out. In Syria, Russia itself is committing war crimes and maybe crimes against humanity. Not only backing Assad's forces, as it used to, I will say, 5 years ago, since 5 years, blocking all the UNSC resolutions on condemning Russia for crimes against humanity, Syria, for crimes against humanity. But actually, Russia is waging in Syria a full-fledged and aggression war. That's the truth. And that's really unprecedented. There is a theoretical question often raised, which is, when does the 21st century start? Some say, 1989, fall of Berlin Wall. Some say the war in ex-Yugoslavia. Some saying 9/11. Some are saying, 2014, the beginning of war and aggressions in Ukraine. But perhaps it may be 2016, because actually the purpose of Russia is really to destroy each human being in Syria. It's just trying to exploit a very specific momentum. Unfortunately, it could stay, for the years or months to come, which is total unwillingness of the US to intervene militarily in Syria. And actually, the real aim of Putin is to become and to show itself as the superpower, just replacing the US. So I think we have to be very conscious of this, which is really, I think, a turning point of history. And actually, neither the international organizations, UN, or even maybe NATO, is able, on this issue, to really deter Russia.
Minister Dolhov, do you agree with that assessment? Is it for Putin just about becoming a new superpower?
At least he pretends to be, and he acts, as we see recently, like a person who would like to be a superpower. Plutonium deal, it's a very serious issue. And the draft law which Putin submitted to the Russian parliament, if you read these 5 points, it's I never seen documents like that. It's a challenge. He challenges US bilateral agreements and nuclear security at all. So there is no limits, unfortunately, and solidarity is one of the most important things which must be opposed now to Russian policy. Within NATO, within EU, and globally. Unfortunately, this country, I mean the Russian Federation, is the permanent member of the UN Security Council with a veto right. It means that nothing would work. We can do nothing, even in the Security Council of the United Nations.
Speaking of doing nothing, again, I'm playing the devil's advocate here, Ambassador, a little bit. When you look at Syria, it appears that Russia is having its way there, doing whatever they want. It appears they're having their way in eastern Ukraine, at least across the border, at least. Playing those two conflicts, do you understand when some people say NATO's just not equipped for that? They're in over their head.
Well, we have to look to these asymmetries in so many ways. First and foremost, NATO is a community of values, even before being a political and military entity. So NATO doesn't conduct actions the way Russia does. Annexation, illegal annexation of territory, supporting insurgents and destabilizing a neighboring country, or the type of activities that has been unfolding in Syria and generated, I would say, quite a large international outcry. So I think, yes, unity is a key aspect within NATO, and I think this has been really not just preserved, it has been strengthened over the last years. I think it has to be linked with what all the other organizations are doing, including the United Nations, the European Union, and so on. I think what the reality, the facts on the ground need to be really shown to the world, analyzed, and actually.
But the facts on the ground aren't very favorable for NATO at the moment.
Well, are they favorable for Russia, maybe?
Well, at least it seems like they, of course, you know, they're working in a different way. As you say, NATO doesn't do annexations and all that, but it seems like the deterrence part isn't working at the moment.
There is a part that NATO is keenly focused, and it is collective defense that is at the core. We have developed a new concept at Warsaw, the one of projecting stability, and that is to help countries in NATO's neighborhood, and this is 360 degrees, not just the countries in the southern neighborhood, also eastern neighborhood, to be better prepared to defend themselves. So these are the kinds of answers we are responding, but it cannot be a quid pro quo. It has to be responsible. It has not to be escalatory. We have been very clear on this. This is why we included, some are saying, balancing deterrence with dialogue. I would say that dialogue is and should be part of deterrence, while deterrence should be part of dialogue as well. They are actually pretty much interlinked. Yes, we're living in an environment that is the most complex for a number of decades, and even deterrence is and should be done, and I'm coming to your first question, in such a way not to generate escalation, but actually to change the calculation of the adversary. How much that has produced an effect? Yes, related to the alliance territory, I would say yes. Was it able to produce more outside? Not so much, and we hope that it will be more in the future. But NATO cannot do this alone when it's about the larger community that would include its neighborhoods, eastern, southern, and on issues that are at the key responsibility, or are the key responsibility of the international community, including the United Nations.
Rolandas, when you look south from Lithuania, how worried are you about what is happening on the southeastern border? You know, not only the Syrian conflict, but also if you look at Turkey, one of the geostrategically probably the most important NATO member at the moment, just having a failed coup attempt.
I will answer in a minute this question, but let me first say something about this Cold War. I don't think that it's really that important how we name the current situation. Cold War, hot war. I heard someone saying that it smells like a Cold War, looks like a Cold War, but nobody wants to call it a Cold War. What's the most important from our perspective is to keep the unity of purpose in place. And one of the purpose has always been to exercise the deterrence, and this exercise of deterrence comes from the constant evaluation of the changing security environment. So we always have to adapt to the security environment. Maybe today is one country, another day could be another country. One day it's a state actor, but it could be a non-state actor. So it's not that important, calling the current situation, but constant adaptation to the changing security environment. Now, talking about the South, the fact that representative, I invited here to this forum, I think it shows that really there's a commonality of challenges, and at least my country, Lithuania, subscribes to this 360-degree security approach. What's the kind of pressure that the southern flank is experiencing is as important as the pressure we experience on the eastern flank, although maybe vulnerabilities at the moment, at this particular moment, might be bigger in the eastern flank. But nevertheless, it's we do also with our modest mean, we contribute to the strengthening of the southern flank. That's why Lithuania is involved in Afghanistan, Iraq, in Mali, in Sofia mission, etc. As for Turkey, it's a crucially important member and partner to the associate member to the European Union, a NATO member states. So for us, it's crucially important to keep Turkey as close as possible and the unity as strong as possible with Turkey. So, and we have to look seriously. Perhaps one thing, we're glad, of course, that relations are back on track with the recent visits by the High Representative Mogherini and Commissioner. So, as we know, European Foreign Minister was also invited to attend the Gymnich meeting of the EU ministers. So there's a discussion now. We hope that all the obstacles will be overcome. The most important, also to engage the Turkish society to do our strategic messaging to show that Turkey is important for us.
Now that was the politically correct part, but since we're entre nous, just you and me, how concerned are you about what's happening in Turkey for the alliance?
Of course we are concerned. We are concerned that
I think you don't have to do anything.
Sorry, the question is what this might lead us in terms of unity and in terms of the future of NATO. And if we would subscribe to the view that one of the biggest aspirations of some third power outside of NATO is maybe to change the European security architecture, European Atlantic link, so this plays very well in the hand of those who wanted to start drawing the new security architecture from the blank page. So we're very concerned, as we are concerned about the Brexit, as we are concerned about the fragmentation of the European Union and various tendencies that are so abundant at the moment.
Nicola, you wanted to react?
Just want to add something, because there is, I think we must have a true understanding of what happens actually. We are of course living very dramatic period of time, and dark times coming back, and tomorrow we will commemorate Anna Politkovskaya 10th anniversary of assassination, just tomorrow, because she was assassinated on October 7th. 2006, we must remember, and we must also remember her message and the message of all the dissidents. That is very important for us, because if we, and many of us, we already launched 10 years ago, 15 years ago, waking call about what could happen. But now, with this extermination war, and I think we have to name the things, in Syria, there will be consequences on Europe. Of course, there was already Ukraine, but it could be new countries facing same threats. And if there is not talking about deterrence, but talking about another power, great power, could be only the US actually, let's be just realistic, able to really deter and tracing red lines to Russia's ambitions. And we know what Russia's meaning. The word was used by President Obama, for Syria in 2013, and we know what red line means. And now the problem is how to enforce red lines. And actually, there is a real problem of, I put the thing bluntly, a real problem of trust, a real problem of credibility. Because actually, Moscow is rendering all the international organizations meaningless. That's its goal. So what are we doing now? And so we are talking about, deterrence. What's deterrence means? True deterrence, credibility about deterrence. Sorry to be a little bit, pessimistic.
What's your suggestion? Do you have one?
I think the very sad suggestion that I have, otherwise I think the situation could be really desperate, is that we have, maybe it could come if, let's hope so, Hillary Clinton is elected, in just 1 month. We must have actually, first of all, a credible US power, first of all. That will, of course, create, I think, a true credibility of NATO, because without, this credible power, I think NATO could be also endangered as well. Its credibility, its unity, etc. Then, of course, the EU must be more powerful, more engaged more in the defense expenditures, defense expenses. There will be a true commitment, even for my country, France, in supporting NATO. And then I think we must have another stance. When a big power, a permanent member of the UNSC, is committing war crimes and crimes against humanity, it's not just only, some crackdown on human rights. Of course, that's very sad, but it's more than that. It's really a turning point. And we shall be aware of this turning point actually in 21st century's history. And then there is also a question, and I will talk with French officials about that. And I wrote also some piece about that. Is it still able to negotiate with Russia, to deal with Russia, to discuss with Russia? Or is it completely meaningless? Actually, my own Minister of Foreign Affairs is in Moscow to discuss about truce, about a new truce agreements. But all truce agreements, including between the US and Russia, were sham. That's all. So, sorry, I don't have a response. Completely answered.
Well, no, but we come back to the question of the beginning. What does Putin want? Because if discussing with them is meaningless, then you would have to rely, as Nicolas just said, on NATO, on the EU, and that's why I wanted to ask you, Ambassador Ducaro, are you happy with how the EU is behaving in this situation?
You would not expect me to do
Again,
in-depth evaluation in works of another organization that I'm not involved in. I can just tell you how NATO engages with the EU, and here I could say that in the last year or two, we have advanced probably more than a decade before. On a couple of aspects, very pragmatic basis, cooperation on a number of projects, in expanded cooperations in frameworks like Afghanistan or where we have missions, Balkans. We have, for the first time, an agreement in a decade. This was on cyber defense cooperation and information exchange, since we're facing the same threats. This has inspired the political declaration at the Warsaw Summit, which in itself will generate a number of other in-depth work on cooperating on hybrid warfare, for example, and so on and so forth. There is also a stronger push towards coordination, complementarity in our outreach to common partnerships, for example, so that we make the programs of the European Union and those of NATO coherent and non-conflicting and non-duplicative. But this leads me to coming back to the basics. I think the basics are to really look in depth and consolidate what I would call the transatlantic unity beyond just institutions. And I should quote, I was inspired 2 days ago by John Kerry's speech in Brussels, who say we should just remember who we are, what we stand for, and should think where we had been today, transatlantic community, if we had bended to the voices or the pressures of those that wanted to divide us over so many years. So there are many disagreements between US and Europe, starting from aspects that are now discussed in the TTIP or the information disclosures aspects and so on. I think those could be refined technically But what we should remind ourselves that we are a community of values of a lot more common interests than, let's say, diverging aspects, and we should look into those. We should think it in the broader term, including our partners, that, like Ukraine and others, that share the values and the way forward, and start from this, going back to the transatlantic basis, and then reconstruct or reinforce where we can the international order, which is, I agree, under a huge pressure, and this is a diplomatic term, of course.
Wouldn't this part of reconstruction, I mean, values are one thing, important, obviously, the basis, but this is also about agility, about being able to move quickly. And now if you look at NATO, 28 member states, if you look at the EU, still 28 member states, they all have to coordinate among themselves, and now they want to coordinate between the EU and NATO. Isn't that something where Putin is at home in Moscow and just chuckling to himself and say, they'll never make it?
I think it was part of his calculation. I think he underestimated the degree of transatlantic unity when the sanctions were imposed, and the fact that they're still applied. Yes, you know, running institutions on democratic principles is maybe not so fast as running an autocracy. But then there's much more legitimacy, and frankly, the outcomes are really linked to the values and the principles that you're attached to. This being said, I think in NATO at least, you see a strong focus on how to make things better, faster, have better information exchange, so situational awareness, analytical capabilities, anticipation capabilities, procedures to take decisions, even under certain parameters, you know, be able to move really fast, exercises. So things have changed compared to about 9 years ago or so, where I first joined the North Atlantic Council, and the tempo was much more, let's say, was much more different. Yeah.
Mr. Dolhoff, I've been seeing you writing down things all the time, taking your microphone. You want to say something?
Yeah, I would like to add, because it's a really important point about cooperation between EU and NATO. And the very same question I asked a week ago in European Commission. I had a meeting with the chairman of military committee. So I learned that since the date of establishment of European tactical groups, no one of them were never activated. It's about discussing future European army. It's about discussing what is new security structure. It's about discussions how to cooperate with NATO. But in this security situation where we are now, and what we learned on our sad experience, while we discuss, he acts, he occupies territories, he violates ceasefire and whatever. So we are unfortunately always late. We just react and do not act in advance. And one of the key issues in terms of deterrence is to elaborate tools to act. Very effective tools. Because what we see now, it's reactive measures, which are not sufficient.
Is there something concrete you would like to see from NATO or the EU? What would you like to see?
Well, one of the very good solutions is to receive Ukraine as a NATO member state. It's a good move.
Is that on the menu at the moment?
The Bucharest decision taken in 2008 that has been and is reiterated that Ukraine will become a NATO member, provided that it so desires, of course, and then the right conditions are met, still stands. Now, so far, there's no, let's say, formal government position of Ukraine on this subject. On the other hand, I think everything that Ukraine is doing internally in terms of its defense reform, and not only, and Ambassador Dolhov and I had the chance to serve together in Brussels, and we go a long way, and he's in a leadership role in this transformation of Ukrainian armed forces and the defense, the whole defense establishment, but even more so, even all the other reforms that Ukraine is performing are actually strengthening its own democratic system, also institutional setup, and are going in the right direction also in terms of requirements that membership will mean. But again, this is not on the agenda right now, also because it's not formally on the agenda of the Ukrainian government.
Rolandas first, and then Nicolas. But I'm sure you're going to react to this. But the question also is, do you think it would be a wise decision, not only Ukraine, but as well Georgia, being part of NATO?
My comment exactly was about this. When we're trying to search for an answer, what does it mean to move from reassurance to deterrence? We tend to focus on defense part, on the military side. Of course, it's important. And first of all, we have to now implement NATO Warsaw Summit agreements to make sure that everything is checked and not put into the jeopardies. And there are some other issues which are not unresolved, and we shouldn't think that now we reached the point when concerns are met. Other issues, other building blocks were also mentioned, like the importance of having a constant U.S. engagement in Europe, since the future of Europe is not only about of Europe, but also about the future of the U.S. and the unity. But equally important, I think, it's also to project the resilience and deterrence further east to the lands that are now so most vulnerable, especially Ukraine, Georgia, etc. Maybe even we know, all of us, that this topic maybe is not the most popular now, but sometimes it seems that we're afraid of our shadow. The perspective of memberships in the treaties, both whether we talk about the NATO and the European Union, but sometimes when our politicians meet and discuss, they're not, they find them uneasy to talk about this stuff. From our experience, it tells when you see the light in the tunnel, when you see in front of you some guidance, how to develop your country, how to build your societies, etc., it makes it all possible to transition through this very difficult period. And that's exactly what Ukraine needs today, what Georgia needs today, and any other country if it chooses to build the countries on our common values.
Nicolas?
Oh, yes, I think that when it comes to NATO, I think of course NATO does have an open door policy, and of course open door policy to Georgia, Ukraine, and maybe other countries come. Then of course we must be very realistic. Actually, the ideas that Ukraine could join NATO because of the unwritten tradition of NATO is probably not possible, because when a country is invaded and pressure from another country, if there is things at NATO, just impossible. But I will say there is also a chicken and egg question. The chicken and egg, I think that if the US and EU are really ready to not only contain Russia, but also to roll back Russia, especially from Ukraine, and I think they shall. Then, of course, the question of NATO membership comes second, because if, the US and the EU are ready to do so I will say membership will be something completely natural, will be the logical consequence, and that I'm hoping for.
I don't have to comment on traditions. I don't know.
Just speak, they'll take care of it.
About traditions. I don't believe that to occupy a part of neighbor's territory is a tradition. No?
Ambassador.
I wanted to refer to one, I think, question that is also fundamental to raise. Why does Russia perceive or chooses to perceive the process of enlargement of NATO as threatening. They mentioned a couple of times. Why doesn't, I don't know, Sweden and Finland perceive it as threatening? I mean, they're even smaller countries in terms of defense capabilities and so on. I should also mention that these enlargements that were successive enlargement, especially with the last 10 countries, they have been done with a fundamental, let's say, political concept also of partnerships. They have not been really meaning any military reinforcements and so on, because we believed in this partnership, in the cooperative security, and also in what we aimed as being a strategic partnership with Russia in the Lisbon strategic concept. We had these reinforcements and this forward presence after what happened in Crimea and these immediate threats towards a sovereign country. So I think this is a legitimate question. Whatever NATO tried to do was actually to do in concert and in dialogue and with clear transparency, and putting forward the political element and the values element, and not so much the military. We were in a way pushed for these quite incremental, I would say, and measured and less than proportionate measures, but I think still strong and in terms of deterrent for collective defense. So again, and other countries that maybe from other points of view should be more threatened because they're smaller. If they would see NATO as a let's say invading, or as a institution that would encircle them, Finland and Sweden, they should perceive it as well. But they don't, because they share the same values. They understand that NATO goes in the same direction.
And I assume it's about spheres of influence as well, Nicolas? Is that what you're getting at?
Oh, yeah, just adding something, because I think NATO is part of the whole story, and part of the story. Other parts are, first of all, we shall not lift sanctions. We shall never lift sanctions. We must increase even and strengthen the sanctions. Actually, we must be, and that's, lifting of sanction will be, I think, a total disgrace, and will be also a treason to basic European values and human rights values. And we must also say that, and I think that the head of state of government in all the EU country must have this stance and explain to the people why they are maintaining or even increasing the sanctions. Then, I was talking about open door to NATO, and I think the question of further EU enlargement, even if not popular, to say the least, in EU countries, further enlargements must be guaranteed, ensured, and we must still have this goal as a real important goal for the next coming years. Because if we stand for European values, enlargement is the logical consequence too.
I would like to add again, please think about consequences of lifting sanctions. I'm sure that the next day you will receive the bill from Mr. Putin. Now you will pay for our losses, as he did it.
He just did that.
In this deal recent on plutonium.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. He just did that. All right. I will ask you all the same question with maybe, if possible, very short answers, so we still have time for 2 or 3 questions from the floor. It's the question that was formulated in the program, basically. The situation we have now, is it the new normal or is it an exception?
It's neither. It shouldn't be a normal, because it cannot be. We should strive for better. We experience better. But we cannot see it as something that will go away very fast. That's why it's not just a simple exception. It's a diversion from what I would say would have been a natural evolution of history in the transatlantic community due to some decision, especially taken by Russia. So I think we will need to not to be in a state of denial, really to understand what happens, to take the facts as they are, and based on our strengths, as I said, the unity, the commonality of values and interests, to try to make it better.
Of course, this situation cannot be considered as normal for Ukraine. Nothing is normal unless territorial integrity of Ukraine is restored.
Yes, I think that's just not normal, but that's maybe, as I've already said, sorry to repeat, the announcement of a new era, an announcement of what could happen, in the coming years or decades, in this century. And that's, of course, a major concern because, as I said, actually what we are witnessing in Europe and Syria, it's really a turning point, a real turning point, and we really must be aware of that.
Landis?
I would like to second Deputy Minister who said there can't be a new normal as long as the annexation and occupation of the Crimea continues. And to remember yesterday's discussion, it's not the Ukrainian issue, it's not the issue between Ukraine and Russia. What's happening in the in the heart of Europe, in the 21st century, in the cradle of democracy. And if this becomes a new normal, so how on earth are we gonna promote the rule of law, international legal system in other parts of the world?
Thank you, Rolandas. So far, we've had a very, I think, lively, dynamic discussion. I want to thank you so far for that. We have time for probably 2 or 3 questions. I would ask you, here are the rules, actually, for the questions. Questions. That's it. 1 question, everybody. Say who you are. No speeches, just questions. That way, it'll be more interesting for everybody. So we have a question right here.
Briefly, I will answer your last question. Unfortunately, it is becoming new normal because what was happening to Georgia in 2008, no one actually talks about this now, and it became normal that Georgia is occupied. Same thing is happening with Ukraine. Yes, I will ask my question. What really NATO and the European Union, and especially Western countries, big Western countries like Germany, France, maybe Netherlands, and many others will do to oppose Russia's strategy to not only invade, but to bring back Soviet Union and Russian Empire on their feet?
Thank you, Ambassador. Anyone specific you would like to answer this question? You have 1 person can answer it. So who would you choose?
I don't know, maybe Ambassador Dukaru, because he is representative of NATO, and maybe he will also tell us, okay, maybe Ukraine is not bidding officially for NATO membership, but Georgia is doing it for a long time, and actually we did our best, and we are actually ready to become NATO member state. So when it will happen? Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. So the question is how to stop the spread of a new Soviet Union?
First, by not recognizing this illegal actions that Russia has promoted, like annexation of Crimea or the consequences of the war in Georgia in 2008, so-called autonomous or so republics. Yes, Georgia's membership to NATO is on the agenda, and it is also benefiting from a mechanism of cooperation with NATO that includes, again, a lot of this self-help that is, I think, key. So strengthening each country's capacity to be able to assure and fulfill its defense and security obligations. This is, when I mentioned the Projecting Stability Initiative, it's all linked in this direction for so many of the countries, especially many that are at the eastern frontier of the alliance. But I think, first and foremost, it's the political unity that should be reflected in everything from statements or actions, decisions like those related to sanctions or those related to the development of exercises, including with partners, support for their security and stability. So this political unity in front of something that cannot be returned. I mean, we cannot be on Yalta territory anymore with spheres of influence and so on. This is an issue of the path. And once countries have been able to choose their path of independence and sovereignty, and this has been recognized at the international scale, this is the only path to go forward.
Okay, I'm going to have a hard time enforcing my just one question rule because the host is asking a question.
We have a whole conversation just after this panel with Ambassador Volkan Bozkır. But in order to frame that conversation, the question to the panelists, and I would like to ask Sorin, but I don't want him to be the punch bag of this panel. So I'm going to ask Nicolas, what do you think the Turkish post-coup situation, how will it impact the ability to move from reassurance to deterrence, and how credible that is unless all the members are strictly aligned on the topic?
Thank you, Andre. I think it's a true question. First of all, and maybe I won't have time to elaborate on Turkey. It will be a very long story because there are a lot actually of uncertainties, about the Turkey's fate, in my opinion. First of all, I just want to point out the fact that I think there is no credibility for a long-term alliance between Turkey and Russia. There was an opportunity, of course, for Putin and Erdogan to meet and to oppose what Erdogan was assessing as a sort of treason of the US during the coup. But I think that their interests, basic interests, are too divergent for this alliance to stay during the years to come. Then I think there is a true human rights concern in Turkey that's obvious, and I think that if there is no more reasonable behavior of Turkey's government in the years to come, it will be very difficult for both the EU and NATO to engage more with Turkey, and it could be a true threat that could destabilize the alliance, basically, of course, the NATO alliance, Atlantic alliance, but also all the agreements between Turkey and the EU, because I think both the US and Turkey and the EU need each other. And I think that's the real problem. I think that we have probably to engage more with Turkey. We have to put the thing on the table with Erdogan, and quite bluntly, I think. And then I think we have to solve the question. But is it able actually to? Are we able to do so? Is Erdogan able to understand what his behavior must be in the years to come? That I really don't know, and that's a big uncertainty again.
Thank you very much. This was a wonderful panel. Give them a hand.